This is House Planning Help episode 31. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you want to know more about self-building or renovating. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century alongside a personal goal of creating my own energy-efficient home. Coming up in this session, we chat to architect, planner and author Graham Towers about whether we can optimise housing density for a sustainable future. So how are you? Thank you for checking out the podcast. And if you're working on a project at the moment, whether it's just the research or perhaps you're further down the line, I hope it's going well. I really enjoy it actually when people get in touch on social media and we can start chatting about various aspects and I find out about projects. So if you're ever on Twitter, that seems to be the one that I like these days, at Ben Adam Smith, and I would love to hear what you're up to. We're going to start this session though I want to tell you about my current bedtime reading. What a good place to start. And this is because I have a stack of books on building that generally sits by the bed, and eventually one by one I get to them. And I finally made it to The House Builder's Bible, which is a book by Mark Brinkley. We spoke to Mark in episode 19, really nice guy. And what I love about the book so far, as I've got into it, it's very accessible, it's a good style of writing, there's a bit of humour in it. You wouldn't expect that for a house building book, but it's certainly there. And I think Mark has been influenced back in the day by Monty Python. You do feel that coming out sometimes in some of the, particularly with the UK, the quirky system that we have, and I've enjoyed that. But chapter 3, Pitfalls, I'm going to read you a very short section here. The self-build exhibitions are full of people who are seriously looking at building a house who basically can't afford to, or at least can't afford to in the expensive areas they already live in. They make inquiries, log on to websites and register interest, and even buy books without ever realising that they haven't got the wherewithal to make it all happen. And it goes on a little bit, but it struck a chord and certainly a fear inside me. Is this me that he's writing about? Or is this you perhaps on your project that you're going to get a number of years down the line and then realise actually this is all a pipe dream? And I come from an industry where deadlines are everything and making things happen. It's all about action. But so far in this, I must admit, I'm enjoying the experience of researching. And I suppose because I'm producing a podcast on it as well, there's a lot of work that goes into that. But mentally, financially, also with everything going on in life, it just feels as if I'm not progressing that far and that the time's not right. So it's that weird situation. But I'm coming to this idea that perhaps it's one of those situations like starting a family where there is never a right time to do it. You've just got to push on through. So I know I've got to start being more realistic. Recently I went through that first year of doing all this research and suddenly it hit me, oh my goodness, that means only 3 years left. So I've got to get realistic in terms of the finances. I've already got this house that most of the mortgage is paid off, so I know I've got money, but I don't know how far that will stretch. And I know it's one of those situations, going back to that paragraph I read, that I do live in an expensive area. So what would that mean? What are the plots around here like? Would we be willing to move? All of those questions, got to get serious and maybe find someone who's an expert on budgets and how all that works, because I've no idea. And that's been one of the funny things looking back on the ebook, is the way that I've really weaved around. It's because I don't really know where I'm going, but it has been a very interesting journey, and we'll talk more about the ebook after our interview. Anyway, I was going to say that I got some help from the Ecology Building Society and started finding out a bit about financing a build. So if you haven't checked out that blog post, then I will link it into today's show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/31. In the UK, there's also this TV programme that's about to start. I've no idea whether it's going to be any good, but about self-builders who have achieved their goals for under £100,000. That would be about $160,000, which is incredible. I've got to watch that, because then that will mean if you can do it for that price, then it's easy. But affordability is a key issue, isn't it? And I'm sure we'll keep coming back to that. Let's get to today's interview, and it's on housing density. This ties in with the recent Google Plus Hangout that we held, and I was interested in whether we have any responsibility as self-builders to think about how we're contributing to the housing density of an area. So we're going to find out more with Graham Towers, architect, planner, and also author. And I started by asking him for a little bit of background on his career.
Well, I trained as an architect in the 60s and had an interest in housing from the time that I graduated. And I got a job working on high-density housing design in about 1969-70. And that led me into beginning to think about what was happening to cities in terms of the fact that we were working on a high-density area of old housing in Islington, which was being demolished to make way for a new high-density scheme. Having worked on that for a couple of years, I began to ask myself, should we really be doing this? I mean, what about the people who are being driven out of this area because of the fact that their homes are being demolished? And that led me to get involved with a community organisation in North Kensington, the Global Neighbourhood Council, which was the first neighbourhood council in this country. That was the process where they were fighting this redevelopment, this wholesale clearance in their area, but were not entirely opposed to redevelopment. So one of the key things that emerged there was the Swinbrook scheme, where an area of Victorian housing was demolished phase by phase. Some people had to move out, but then people could be rehoused as each new phase was completed, so the community could be kept intact. And then I've gone from there into academic work for several years, teaching planning actually and architecture. And then in the 80s I worked for Islington Architects Department, where we were working on I was working mostly on the regeneration of housing estates built in the 1930s and from the 1950s. So, and that was, we had to do a lot of community consultation with the tenants who were living in these housings. So that was somewhere where it taught me a lot about how to deal with participation and user involvement in the design of housing. And from there I left Islington in 1992, and since then I've been mostly researching and writing, and I published 3 books on housing which deal with certain various aspects. One was to deal with community architecture. The second one was looking at how we can deal with problem estates from the 60s and 70s. And the more recent one was a general introductory book about design of urban housing. So that's more or less up to date.
Maybe we could go back to the beginning when we're talking about housing density, and I just ask you simply, what is it?
Well, housing density is measured in various ways. It's basically a measure of the number of housing bed spaces on a particular area of land. And there are various units of measuring it. Perhaps we don't need to go into all that, but do you want to go into that?
Go on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's the lowest level is net residential density, which is the number of bed spaces on a housing site. And then there's gross residential density, which includes the whole area with all the community facilities in it. And then there's a measure of density which is called development density, which is a sort of density of a whole town, a whole urban area. And these are measured in various ways. They can be measured in bed spaces per hectare, which is a sort of measure of the number of people who might be living there. They can be measured in housing units, dwellings per hectare, which is a measure of the number of houses, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how many people are going to live there. And in some areas, particularly on the continent of Europe, or rather not Britain particularly, there's a measurement in terms of housing floor space, a number of housing square metres for housing on a particular area of land. So that tells you the level of you might expect in terms of bed spaces, occupants, people living on an area. But the other factor which is critical really is the level of occupancy. So you can have areas which are quite high in terms of bed spaces. I mean, like this one, for example, is quite high in terms of bed spaces. But most of the bed spaces are not fully occupied. So you can get areas where there's apparent high density, but for low levels of occupation, the number of people is not great. Whereas in social housing in particular, a lot of social housing is over-occupied, so that there's many more people living in an area than it was designed to take. So this creates housing stress and problems of maintenance and decay and social problems as well. So that's where density becomes a problem. I suppose one of the factors is that in terms of energy conservation and tackling climate change, we do have to build more high-density housing, because that means that, first of all, when the houses are close together, particularly whether it's terraced housing or flats, there's less heat loss because of the fact that they're protected by other dwellings. And it also has an effect on transport and services, because in high-density areas it's much easier to service for things like deliveries and refuse collection, as well as things like providing bus services and good public transport, and providing things like water, gas, electricity, cable and so on. So all those things are cheaper in areas of high density. And because they're cheaper and easier to provide, they use less energy. And that's why I think that if we're going to tackle climate change effectively, we do have to be looking at density as being a key factor in reducing the costs of cities. I mean, if you look at American cities, you see these single house on a plot and another single house. That's so inefficient in terms of both the use of land and the servicing and the energy costs that it's really not sustainable.
You've mentioned some of these points already, but I'd be quite interested in just going through this methodically. What are the benefits of having low-density housing and some of the benefits of having high-density housing?
The benefits of low-density housing, I don't think in terms of economic and climate change efficiency, I don't think there are any benefits to low-density housing myself.
But does it make a nicer place to live? If effectively you must be in a low-density area here, or would we not call this?
No, I think the problem is that if you get very high density, particularly if it's social housing, low-income housing, it creates all sorts of problems. So there are disbenefits to that. If you get low-density housing, which is what has grown up in the Western world, particularly as a result of the Garden City movement of the early 20th century, mass housing has become, particularly for those who can afford to pay for their housing directly, the norm has become low-density suburban sprawl. And that is highly inefficient in terms of the fact that you can't provide all the services that people need within walking distance or easy travel distance of their homes. So it creates demand for a lot of roads, a lot of car travel, and that in itself is a disbenefit. I mean, part of the problem, which never seems to be addressed currently, is the transport system in this country just doesn't work. You know, constantly you hear of long delays and jams on motorways and so on. And that's because the transport system is designed to meet a low-density environment. And therefore, the only efficient way of people have, really, of travelling is travel by car. So the question of density has an effect on the way the whole society functions. Now, I suppose the argument in favour of low density is basically the Garden City argument. Victorian cities were very high density, and they suffered enormous problems in terms of health, transmission of disease, pollution from factories and coal burning. So, I mean, the Garden City movement was a sort of justifiable reaction against the horror of the Victorian cities. And we've created a lot of low-density housing, particularly in the period between the wars in the 20s and 30s. I think 3 million houses were built during that period, mostly in sort of peripheral estates, suburban sprawl. And there was, in London, for example, there was a 20-mile ring of low-density housing built around the whole city. A lot of that was private housing, built by private developers, but about two-thirds probably, and then about 1 million houses built by the public sector for social housing. And in the post-war period, that went on. We had things like the New Towns movement in the 40s and 50s, which was part of the legacy of the Garden City movement. And at the same time, from the 50s onwards particularly, there were relatively high-density housing estates built in the inner areas of cities, which were initially tower blocks and then more complex forms of high-density housing, which proved to be unsustainable in the sense that the systems broke down and they became degenerated in terms of abuse and decay and overcrowding. So I think from the 1970s onwards, or late 1970s onwards, we began to be looking at some other intermediate form, not high density, but not low density. So we're looking at something which was about like the density of this area, where's terrace housing, which is relatively efficient because it's, the houses are close together and they shelter each other from energy terms. And at the same time, the research was beginning to show that although in the 50s and a lot of terrace housing was knocked down and replaced by tower blocks and slab blocks and other forms of high-density housing, in fact, the Victorian terrace house was about the same density as the tower blocks and slab blocks which replaced them. So that it became obvious that what you needed to do was to create something similar in terms of density level, which would work because although they'd locked a lot of Victorian housing down, there's a lot of it was kept and renovated and became highly valued. I mean, this areas like this, for example, which is mostly terraced housing, but it's it's very highly valued environmental area. So this is a sort of model that we're looking at, which is on one hand it's relatively high density, but it's also efficient in the sense that it's relatively easy to service, it's relatively low energy consumption, and it provides an attractive environment which people want to live in.
Are we saying here that there is an optimum housing density, really? You don't want to go down the low density route, particularly, I suppose, in the UK where land it's limited. We could use the land, but we might regret that further down the line. Yeah. And then if we go too far the other way, we will have issues that air pollution, a lot of traffic. Can you avoid those elements in high density areas?
Well, if we look at the areas of where housing works, the European city is a good model actually, because a lot more people live in flats in European cities, but they're also a very attractive environment which people appreciate. And those areas are not high density, but they are relatively high density. So yes, there's an intermediate model, which I think is basically what could be described as the model of the European city and some of Britain's cities as well.
Is there an onus on us as people who want to self-build? How can we be part of that? Do we just have to be mindful of how much space we're using?
Well, I mean, there's a quite well-known study, which I've quoted somewhere, I can't remember where it came from originally, but it was done in America to compare housing in suburban areas and in urban areas. So they took models of two families, one family living in a suburban area with a very highly efficient house, which had very high energy standards, and one family living in a city area, which was unimproved. And what they found was that the family living in the unimproved house in the inner city used less energy than the family living in the suburban house, which had been highly insulated. And that was because the family living in the suburban house had to travel long distances to work, and all the goods and services that they needed had to be brought to their house, whereas the family living in the inner city had all these things close by, so they didn't need to travel to work, and they could walk to work and to their local services and so on. And I think that's a very instructive study, because it just shows that you don't really, a lot of models of energy efficient housing have been built in suburban areas, but really that's not a sustainable model. You've got to have relatively high density coupled with good levels of insulation and energy efficiency and so on.
Would it be a crazy idea to say, our cities of the future, perhaps we've got to make sure that cars aren't in them. How can we create really dense areas that also are full of fresh air and a few green spaces that are shared, obviously, but how do we achieve that?
Well, I mean, I have a view that the smaller cities in Britain are useful models because they have relatively high density and they have concentrations of services, which means you can walk to most places. I mean, that's partly the reason I moved to Brighton, because it has all these things. It's sort of setting in the environment, which is good, but the actual city itself is compact. It has high levels of service, and it's easy to walk to most things you need to do, whether it's healthcare or shopping or visiting friends. There's a town in Germany where they've more or less banned private cars and everybody has to use public transport, which I think is one part of the answer. There's a model city in Abu Dhabi which they've built recently, which is highly energy efficient. And in terms of energy, one of the things that the irony is that in hot climates, dispersed housing needs much more cooling, so it needs a lot of energy to cool it rather than to heat it. And air conditioning costs a lot of money in terms of running it. So part of the model that they've used in this city in Abu Dhabi is to be densely built so that there are narrow streets which keep out the sun and reduce the heat concentration. And that means that because it's a compact city, it's easy to service, and they have a space-age form of transport system with automated cars that run by computer and so on. I think we've got enough information where we could work out how to build cities which were more sustainable, at the same time very attractive.
Is there a case when a place is actually deemed full? And I think about this from the bigger perspective of the world as well, but does this come into this debate, or is it totally separate?
Well, there are areas like the favelas in South America and places like Mumbai in India where levels of population are so dense that it does create a lot of problems. I mean, particularly in the sense that the people living there are living in squalid conditions, which is something that doesn't necessarily relate to climate change, but it's something that we want to avoid in terms of human dignity and so on. So there is a level where levels of crowding does become unacceptable for social reasons, for no other. And I think one of the other problems is that in terms of housing, you can build housing at moderately high densities in forms which are sustainable and pleasant to live in, which means basically terrace housing and small blocks of flats. And there has been some movement in some parts of the world to creating a lot of housing in tower blocks and very high density housing, notably Hong Kong and some cities in the east. So there's still a sort of movement in some areas, some places, to build large numbers of tower blocks for residential use, which I don't think is particularly desirable in terms of it doesn't provide very good living environment. I haven't sufficient experience of these large areas of tower blocks and so on to know that. I've looked at some in Britain. There's one in Glasgow, for example, Red Road, which is an extraordinary development of massive tower blocks set in a sort of almost suburban, undeveloped area, which was built with virtually no services and no transport links. So it's an extraordinary thing. So, I mean, that doesn't work because it's just housing and just provides shelter. It doesn't actually provide all the things that you need for an effective place to live. There's a well-established theory about housing, that housing doesn't just mean dwellings, flats or houses. It means all the things that are necessary for a residential environment, and that means local shops provide food and basic services. It needs healthcare facilities. It needs open space where children can play outside and so on. So there's a whole gamut of things which are essential to effective and useful and good housing, which has to be provided as part of the housing development. You can't just build houses and think that people are going to be able to function without all these support services.
So maybe we could just conclude by looking at, are there areas that don't work for one reason or another? Energy efficiency is obviously very important, and perhaps it is that the density just didn't work. Can you see a future where we're redeveloping large areas across the globe, I suppose?
Well, my own view would be that, if you're going to do that, you need to have housing which provides all the necessary support services. The other factor is, it's been established that housing doesn't work very well if it's a sort of one-class area. It probably works quite well for relatively wealthy middle-class people, but it doesn't work very well for low-income people. And the research has shown that in mixed communities where there's a mix of tenures, a mix of incomes, a mix of social skills and so on, that mixed communities work better in the sense that for poorer people, the low-income people, and the people without employment skills, those people are more successful in mixed communities than in social housing ghettos where there is one-class communities. So the current thinking is that for the health of society, it's better to have communities which are mixed in these various things, mixed in income levels, age mix, and educational levels, so that in all senses, communities should reflect social structure as a whole. And mixed communities is currently thought would be the most successful way of providing housing.
Well, Graham, we've had some great information today, so I'd just like to thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for coming.
The show notes for this episode are online at houseplanninghelp.com/31. At the bottom, we've got a question for you, as we like to do. Has the housing density of an area had any bearing on why you've chosen to live there? I'd like to know about that. Or you can comment on something else related to this episode. That's just at the bottom of that page, houseplanninghelp.com/31. In terms of my ebook, it's progressing nicely. It's going to be available at the beginning of October 2013, so that's around about just under a month away if you're listening as this has been released. But it's been really interesting to reflect on the last year and also the organic route that I've taken. I'm fully aware now that I'm going to have to focus it down quite a lot just so that it makes sense more than anything. We can always do more of these at a later date, and as I say, as next year when that comes around, that should be quite an exciting prospect. But I'm trying to tie in some video, but at the same time not overloading myself because this is the first time that I've done it. But I'd like to thank everyone who took part in the survey. There's still an opportunity to do this if you haven't had time to or didn't manage to refer to the show notes. So check it out, houseplanninghelp.com/31. I'll put the link at the bottom of the page there. One final call to action to finish up on today, and this is to help get the word out about the podcast. I'm trying to bring you the best content that I possibly can. So if you are on Twitter, then I'd love you to show your support right now by going to houseplanninghelp.com/share. And you can do this from a mobile, from an iPad, desktop, wherever. What this does is it pre-populates a tweet letting your friends know that you listen to the show, and it'll help us get the word out to other people who might be interested in this content. So houseplanninghelp.com/share. Do it now, and I will tell you about what's coming up next time. Tim Hulse from EcoVert Solutions, he'll be my guest as we look at insulation, particularly when it comes to old houses. Until then, take care.